Second here. I apologize. Before we begin, I'd like to welcome members of the public to this open meeting. For those individuals who have signed up to speak today, please note this is an opportunity to present your comments to the members of the board. It is not a question and answer session. Speakers will be called upon by the chair and will be granted 2 minutes to speak. Pursuant to Public Law 1975, Chapter 231, the Open Public Meetings Act, public notice of this meeting was filed on March 7th, 2021 with the Office of the Secretary of the State of New Jersey and 3 newspapers, the Cherry Hill Courier Post, the New Brunswick Home News Tribune, and the Newark Star Ledger. Pursuant to Public Law 2020, notice of the meeting has been posted on the Rutgers website under Governing Boards. I'd like to ask all of the members, you've seen the agenda and the meeting materials posted on the Governing Board portal. Does anyone have a conflict of interest to disclose at this time? Mr. Chair, I do not see any. We may continue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The first order of business today is the swearing in of our 2 new board members. I see Dr. Mohammed Zubair. Welcome. Kim, is Kevin with us?
I do not see him, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Well, if he joins, we will call an audible. Mr. Attorney General, would you please swear in Dr. Zubair?
I will. Good morning, Dr. Zubair. Before we do this, you have the option to swear or affirm, and you have the option at the end for me to say, "So help me God." Do you have a preference with regard to those 2?
Yes, go ahead and say, "Help me God."
And swear or affirm.
Swear is fine.
Okay. Thanks. Okay, Dr. Zubair, you ready?
Yes.
I, Mohammed A. Zubair,
I, Muhammad A. Zubair,
do solemnly swear
do solemnly swear
that I will support the Constitution of the United States
that I will support the Constitution of the United States
and the Constitution of the State of New Jersey,
and the Constitution of the State of New Jersey,
that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same
that I will bear the true faith and allegiance to the same
and to the governments established in
and to the government established in
the United States and in this state,
the United States and in this state,
under the authority of the people,
under the authority of the people,
and that I will faithfully,
and that I will faithfully,
impartially,
impartially,
and justly perform
and justly perform
all the duties of the office
all the duties of the office
of member of the Board of Governors of Rutgers,
of the member of the Board of Governors of Rutgers,
the State University of New Jersey,
the State University of New Jersey,
according to the best of my ability.
according to the best of my ability.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Congratulations, Dr. Zubair.
Thank
You're
you.
here. John, you did that so well. Kevin Egan is now with us. Would you do it again, please?
Sure, of course. Kevin, you have the option to either swear or affirm in the beginning, and then you have the option to repeat "So help me God" at the end. Do you have a preference for those 2? Mark, I don't see Kevin, nor do I hear a response.
I don't hear the response either. Kim, do you see Kevin?
Mr. Chair, I did see him. It looks like his camera has turned off. I am not sure if he has audio, so
Okay.
we might have to come back.
No worries. We will swear him in before the next meeting. Dr. Zubair, welcome. The next order of business, is our presentation and resolution. Mr. Gower, over to you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, everyone. In June of 2016, the Board of Governors and the Board of Trustees approved a revision to the university's investment policy 40.2.14. This revision was in response to a series of discussions around the university and before the Joint Committee on Investments regarding investments directly or related to fossil fuels within the long-term investment pool. Before that time, there was not a process that the JCOI could use to assess that or similar requests. At the request of the JCOI, President Barchi appointed a committee of students, faculty, administration, and board members led by Senior Vice President Barbara Lee to develop a process by which requests could be evaluated. This committee's report, codified in Appendix B of the investment policy, recommended that the following principles should be applied to any consideration. The divestment, number one, the divestment is consistent with the fiduciary obligation of the JCOI and the boards. Number two, the behavior, action, or product in question is antithetical to the core mission or values of the university. Number three, the organization, industry, or entity to be divested has sole or shared responsibility for the concerns identified. And number four, the concern reflects the consensus of the university community. This process to assess divestment requests starts with the Office of the Secretary. If a divestment request comes in, the chair of the Joint Committee on Investments and I would assess such requests against the criteria that I just noted. If the two of us determine that the request does meet those criteria, we would request an ad hoc committee be set up to consider the following issues and to advise the JCOI. Number one, whether there is a consensus among a wide array of stakeholders that the subject of the divestment request is a concern that affects either the university community and or people beyond its borders. Number two, whether the university community has taken action to disengage from the organization, industry, or entity being considered, for instance, in its purchasing decisions. Or number three, whether the subject of the divestment request is a social injury of such magnitude that, if not addressed, will directly affect a significant number of individuals. Such a committee would then recommend action if appropriate to the JCOI. Only the JCOI can make a divestment recommendation to the boards, and each of the boards must agree for that recommendation to become policy. In the spring of 2020, the secretary received the first full submission under this policy and forwarded it to the JCOI chair, to Locke Law, and to me. The COVID emergency delayed our assessment of that request until July, but then Locke and I determined that the request for divestment from fossil fuel or supporting companies met the criteria. President Holloway asked Brian Ballantyne, Senior Vice President for Strategy, to set up and lead an ad hoc committee as set out in the policy, and that work began when the academic year commenced. I now ask Dr. Ballantyne to speak about the work of the ad hoc committee and its recommendations to the JCOI. Brian?
Thank you, Mike. Let me begin by thanking the Board of Governors for considering this resolution and thanking truly the members of the ad hoc committee who are engaged in this process for their thoughtfulness and the rigor with which they've approached the work and which you would expect from the Rutgers community. The ad hoc committee was comprised of 15 members, 6 faculty members, 4 students, and 5 members from the administration. The committee worked diligently from December through February to produce its recommendations. To begin, the committee analyzed the questions outlined in the advisory statement on divestment, discussed the principles that would drive our work, and the importance of this committee to serve as a guide to future committees considering similar questions. We were briefed on the status of fossil fuels in the endowment, and we were briefed on the board's fiduciary responsibilities as they pertain to our potential recommendations. The committee then divided into 3 subcommittees, each led by a faculty member, to consider the questions that Mr. Gower just mentioned from our policy, whether or not there was consensus across a wide array of stakeholders, evidence of university actions related to fossil fuels already, And finally, the ethical and social injury concerns of fossil fuel investments locally and globally. At our second meeting, the subcommittees each reported back on their preliminary determinations and findings. Those notes are included in the appendix of the memo, which I believe you all have seen. In our deliberations, we observed a cross-cutting agreement in our community related to fossil fuel investments. We observed that multiple and diverse groups have expressed support for divestment from fossil fuels. We saw evidence from student leadership, faculty, the community at large, and a clear commitment to carbon neutrality from the university itself. We noted how frequently divestment has been a topic at community-wide town halls led by the President's Climate Task Force. We noted that the issue itself and agreement around its importance is enduring and consistent, that the university's leadership role in sustainability and carbon neutrality has been central for years, and fossil fuel divestment is an extension of that priority. And we observed the well-documented evidence that divestment aligns with our stated values around public health and social justice. Finally, the subcommittee worked to draft the recommendations for path forward on divestment from fossil fuels. They did this with attention both to the fiduciary responsibility of the boards and the expectations and values of our community. In our recommendations, we erred on the side of brevity. We felt that the body of evidence from the community and the university itself is compelling. And I think from there, the path that we recommend in terms of precedent represents a high bar for future committees to consider. We aspired to keep our recommendations simple. As you can see, they fall into three main categories: cease all new fossil fuel investments, divest from passive index funds within 1 year, exit all current private investments within 10 years. We also recommend informing our investment partners of our stance to ensure their instruments align with our values, and regular review of our portfolio to ensure consistency on our position. I'd finally like to commend the JCR and the boards for adding a commitment in the proposed resolution to annual reporting. And with that, let me thank the committee members again, many of whom I see are on the call today, especially our students who have played such a leadership role as thought leaders during this process, and turn it back over to Mr. Gower.
Thank you, Brian. Mr. Chair, with your permission, I'd like to read the resolution that's being considered today.
Yes, please proceed.
So on Friday, March the 5th, the Joint Committee on Investments endorsed the following resolution for consideration by this board at this time and the Board of Trustees later today. Whereas the Rutgers University investment policy includes a process the university should follow when members of the university community request that funds within the Rutgers University endowment be divested from, or that the investment office should avoid making new investments in certain industries, sectors, or companies due to a potential conflict between the university's position on an issue or agenda that is held or advanced by such industries, sectors, or companies. And whereas in the spring of 2020, the Joint Committee on Investments received a request from the Endowment Justice Collective, an association of several Rutgers student groups, individual students, professors, alumni, and community members to divest from fossil fuels, among other sectors. And whereas pursuant to the process, the chair of the Joint Committee on Investments and the university's executive vice president and chief financial officer determined that EJC's request regarding fossil fuels should proceed to the next step in the process, which is to form an ad hoc committee to evaluate the divestment request and make a recommendation to the Joint Committee on Investments. And whereas the chair and CFO formed an ad hoc committee of students, faculty members, and administrators from across Rutgers University that conducted its work in evaluating the divestment request in light of the three major elements set forth in the investment policies process regarding divestment requests, and concluded its work by submitting the attached report dated February 22nd, 2021 to the chair and CFO. And whereas, as further described in the ad hoc committee's report, the ad hoc committee recommends that the university divest from fossil fuel investments by taking the following actions. Number one, cease all new investments in funds whose strategy is focused on fossil fuel investments. Number two, divest from passive index funds with exposure to fossil fuel investments within 1 year and reinvest in environmentally friendly versions of those indices. In addition, actively seek new investment opportunities in renewable energy and energy efficiency categories, provided they deliver competitive rates of return. Number 3, exit all currently held private fossil fuel investments within 10 years or as soon as practicable. Number 4, because some commingled funds may hold minimal exposure to fossil fuels, emphasize the university's stance on this topic to investment partners, urging them to review their own processes and decisions regarding the inclusion of such assets in client portfolios. And whereas on March 5th, 2021, the Joint Committee on Investments reviewed and discussed the ad hoc committee's report and determined that the ad hoc committee properly evaluated the divestment request, agrees that the recommendations can be enacted in accordance with the fiduciary responsibilities of the boards, and recommends that the Board of Governors and the Board of Trustees adopt the ad hoc committee's recommendations on divestment from fossil fuels. And whereas in addition to adopting the ad hoc committee's recommendations, the JCOI states for the sake of clarity that these recommendations also include divestment from fossil fuel investments held in separately managed accounts owned by the university within the long-term investment pool, and recommends that the investment office report progress on this divestment initiative annually. Now, therefore, be it resolved that upon the recommendation of the JCOI, the Board of Governors and the Board of Trustees of Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey, each agrees that Rutgers should divest from fossil fuel investments as more specifically described in the ad hoc committee's report attached hereto, and adopts the ad hoc committee's recommendations. And be it further resolved that the investment office should implement the recommendations within the parameters described in the report, while also being mindful of its fiduciary duty to apply the standard of care applicable to investment offices generally, and report progress on this divestment initiative annually. And be it further resolved that the Board of Governors and the Board of Trustees of Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey, hereby thank each and every member of the ad hoc committee for agreeing to be part of the committee and for the work, effort, and time each member contributed to the process. And be it further resolved that the university's investments policy, University Policy 40.2.14, be amended by adding a copy of this resolution as Appendix C thereof. And be it finally resolved that this resolution shall take effect upon approval by the Board of Governors and the Board of Trustees. Mr. Chair, we ask the board to accept this resolution. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. Before we proceed, a couple of formal matters. Third time lucky, maybe. Mr. Attorney General, would you try again with Mr. Egan, please?
I'm on the phone if you can hear me.
Great, Kevin. Welcome. Thank you. John
I
Hoffman.
can.
over to you.
I got video here. I got video though. So here I am.
There you go.
How are you?
Kevin, it's John Hoffman. How are you?
John, how are you today?
Good. Do you prefer that you swear or affirm? And would you like to respond to the phrase, "So help me God" at the end? That's your choice.
I'll swear and say, "So help me God" at the end. Yes.
All right. Are you ready?
Yes.
I, Kevin P. Egan,
I, Kevin P. Egan,
do solemnly swear
do solemnly swear
that I will support the Constitution of the United States
that I will support the Constitution of the United States
and the Constitution of the State of New Jersey,
and the Constitution of the State of New Jersey,
that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same
that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same
and to the governments established in
and to the governments established in
the United States and in this state,
the United States and in this state,
under the authority of the people,
under the authority of the people,
and that I will faithfully,
and that I will faithfully,
impartially,
impartially,
and justly perform
and justly perform
all the duties of the office of member of the Board of Governors of Rutgers,
all of the duties of officer of member of Board of Governors of Rutgers,
the State University of New Jersey,
the State University of New Jersey,
according to the best of my ability.
according to the best of my ability.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Congratulations, Kevin.
Thank you, John. Appreciate that.
Here, and welcome, Mr. Egan. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me, Chairman. Appreciate it.
Before we proceed to voting on the resolution at hand, 8 individuals have signed up to make remarks to us today. Kim, would you please call one at a time on the first 6 individuals to sign up, all of whom are students?
Certainly, Mr. Chair. First on the list is Mr. Abi Kanaria. I apologize if I said that wrong.
Yep, it's Abi Canaria. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for allowing me to speak. First, I want to start by thanking the ad hoc committee for allowing me to work as one of the students rep. Brief introduction. I am the current treasurer of the Rutgers Student Governing Association in Camden. And it was also a pleasure to work on the committee. I wanted to make a brief statement that, the committee, the request at hand will help the university make a stronger stance to not only the society, but to also the other higher education institutions, that we are staying true to our mission and statement, as well as our values, and that we hear the students as well as our other stakeholders' voices. As me and other fellow students get increasingly concerned about the environmental issues that we face today, this action of divesting from fossil fuels will help us have a stronger voice together, being a part of the university, to say that the investment in fossil fuels is not okay, and will help us advocate more for lesser consumption of fossil fuel, as well as less production of the fossil fuels. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Kim?
Next on the list is Mr. Nitin Shanas. And I am going to unmute you in 1 second. Okay, please proceed.
Hello, thank you, Madam Secretary and Mr. Chair. So as mentioned, my name is Nitin Shanas, and I'm a senior at Rutgers Camden and RSGA president. You cannot see me, but I'm currently wearing a Rutgers shirt. My friends and family can vouch for the fact that I wear Rutgers shirts often, and that's because I'm proud to be a member of this community. But today, I'm especially proud. As a soon-to-be alumnus, I cannot help but acknowledge my belief that I will fondly remember this day, a day where Rutgers administration and the Board of Governors made the right decision to divest from fossil fuels and move towards a sustainable future. Issues of sustainability and renewable energy are tough, and that is because the decision often comes down to the needs of the present and the needs of the future and balancing the two. But today, you're willing to admit that the future is just as important. Rutgers champions itself as a beloved community, and inherent in that are the following beliefs. First, the need to take care of all community members, including residents living in Camden, New Brunswick, and Newark. And second, the need to ensure that all voices are heard. We know that fossil fuel emissions and environmental issues writ large overwhelmingly affect communities of color, and we know that fossil fuel use by Rutgers University continues to leave a negative impact on our surrounding communities and local residents. This shift would mean taking a stand in saying that those communities and their future is just as important. I will end by saying this. Local residents and people of color represent silent voices that continue to be all too often unheard in these types of decisions. But today, you're choosing to uplift their voices by ensuring that Rutgers does not harm them in its environmental calculus. You're choosing to make the right decision for our beloved community, and that's why I'm proud to be a Scarlet forever. Thank you for your time, for inviting me to speak, and for making this crucial decision.
Thank you very much, Mr. Student Government President. Please, next, Kim.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Miss Oriana Holmes Price is next, and you've been unmuted.
Good morning, governors. My name is Oriana Holmes-Price. I'm a senior political science major at Rutgers University Camden, and I'm the current Rutgers Camden chapter chair and state board vice chair with NJ-PIRG Students, the largest student-run, student-funded advocacy group in the state working on social and environmental issues. Here on behalf of all three NJ-PIRG student chapters, located at each Rutgers campus, we support the board's decision to divest from fossil fuels and to reinvest in green renewable energy sources. NJ-PIRG's top priority this spring is our 100% renewable energy campaign. Our goal is to get President Holloway to commit the university to the transition to 100% clean renewable energy by 2030 in the final draft report of the Climate Task Force report. We're currently building university-wide support for the campaign by working with numerous environmental student organizations, partnering with people like Natan at the SGA to pass sustainability resolution. And we've collected more than 3,300 petition signatures with more support to follow. And through these same tactics, the student PIRGs, which we belong to, have achieved national victories in 7 states across dozens of campuses in just the last 4 years, including the University of California system and UMass Amherst. So we're hoping to add Rutgers to that list. And this action to divest the university from fossil fuels is climate leadership, and we do urge a stronger climate task force report to continue on this commitment. We support the board's decision on item 6A and urge President Holloway to support the transition to 100% clean renewable energy by 2030, aligning Rutgers as a leading statewide player in the fight against the climate crisis. Thank you for your time and for allowing me to speak.
Amen. Thank you very much. Kim?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Next is Mr. Nicholas LaBelle.
Thank you, Madam Secretary, and thank you, members of the board. Mr. Chair, I'd like to congratulate Mr. Zubair, or Dr. Zubair, Mr. Egan as well for being inducted into this prestigious body, so I congratulate you on that. As mentioned, my name is Nicholas LaBelle, and I have the honor to serve as the student body president at Rutgers, New Brunswick, which is for over 40,000 students. This past year has been a hard one, as many of you know, and we've been proud to stand in support with the administration and student body to do action in that respect. One of the things we're most proud of is working with the nation's first COVID-19 relief fund. And you can ask Senator Mays, who's part of your body, about that if you'd like to. But I come today to speak to you about university policy put forward 40.2.11 related to fossil fuels. For the past 4 years, myself and dozens of students you've heard from today have been working with faculty, admin, and members of the board to talk about these issues. And so I came to speak about the 4th article that was put forth about community consensus. As you heard from A.G. Hoffman, we are here under the authority of the people. Well, the people have spoken and spoken in wide degree. This past fall, we had a referendum put to ballot where we had thousands of students vote in the midst of a pandemic. And in that election, over 90% of students voted in the affirmative to divest from fossil fuels and adopt these resolutions. To put it quite simply, people were ecstatic, students, were overjoyed, and many students, frankly, I can honestly say shed tears over this because they've been spending hours upon hours of their past collegiate career focusing on this issue day and night. And I want to thank you on their behalf for hearing their voices, hearing these concerns, and allowing this to move forward. And then on a more practical note, with future responsibility, green energy is the future. As seen on the federal, state, local policy levels, we cannot be left behind. We have to be a foreleader and a leader in all respects moving forward. Rutgers should be a proud part of that future because, as Gavin would say, Rutgers is revolutionary, not reactionary. We must maintain ourselves as a leader in the field, working to work tirelessly to ensure social justice, environmental justice, and fiduciary responsibility moving forward. And this resolution does as such. So Natasha mentioned, the global community. I'll quote Rutgers' motto: "Sun of righteousness shine upon the West also." Board of Governors, in this election today, if we put this motion forward, that sun is shining and shining brightly upon this campus and our campus's future. So I thank you for your time today. I thank you for your consideration and insight, and I implore you to pass the resolution for the sake of our campus and the sake of our campus's future. Thank you.
And thank you. Kim?
Miss Amanda Ketterer, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for hearing all of our student voices today. My name is Amanda Ketterer. I'm a graduating senior of Rutgers Camden, double majoring in political science and urban sustainability and agriculture. I am a civic scholar, an ILA mentor, and the founder of the Office of Civic Engagement Garden. Now, I know some of you heard my second major and kind of cocked your heads. I am one of the first Rutgers Camden students to bridge the gap between Camden and New Brunswick through the Urban Studies Department and Agriculture and Food Systems Department of New Brunswick and Camden. I had the honor and privilege of working with the greatest minds on both campuses to better understand renewable energy, sustainable agriculture, and climate neutrality. Now, while I was there, I was able to take a course with Dr. Zinnia Morin called Food Waste, where I was able to understand the impacts of food waste, not only in our country, state, but on the campus itself. In this opportunity, I was able to explore one of the gorgeous buildings on the Bush Douglas campus, where I found an anaerobic digester. Now, an anaerobic digester is something that takes all the food waste of the beautiful juice bar and cafeteria of said building and actually creates sustainable energy from a renewable resource of all the food waste that students throw into the baskets, into the trash bags in that building. It brings tears to my eyes thinking of how proud I was in that moment to know that the university I transferred to, that my father and my sister graduated from, was making so many efforts to include students, faculty, and staff all into this wonderful ecosystem that bridged the gap between education of renewable energy and actually was doing something to empower the community. I then went back to my Rutgers Camden campus, and I realized we did not have the same resources and equity in this amount of renewable energy that Rutgers New Brunswick had within Rutgers Camden. I'm hoping that with this bill, not only are we empowering students on all 3 campuses, but we'll be able to empower the communities of Camden, Newark, and New Brunswick. It is not only going to be a necessity, but an expectation of students going forward to have this amount of renewable energy on each campus, and to have the accountability that we are leaders in all of the communities that we are in as an institution. We are example setters of the state. We are example setters of the country. I could not be more proud on this day to participate in this conversation, and I thank you for hearing student voices. And I can also say that Natan Shamez absolutely is wearing a Rutgers t-shirt. He is a colleague of mine, and I could not be more proud to speak with him on this day. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Thank you, Ms. Ketterer. Kim.
Mr. Chair, the final student sends his regrets, but something came up and he is not in attendance right now. So that is all for the students that have signed up.
Thank you very much. We have 2 more speakers. One is Dr. David Hughes. Dr. Hughes, over to you, sir.
Okay, thank you very much, Mark. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can, David. Please proceed.
I'm going to speak about this lovely resolution rather than about the most pressing issues, because this is the most pressing issue. I want to commend the board. Oh, I should tell you, if you don't know, that I'm the president, the Climate Justice Chair and Treasurer of Rutgers AUP-AFT, the faculty and grad union that represents all full-time faculty, teaching assistants and graduate assistants outside the medical school. This step has been a long time coming, and I commend the board for taking it. You're putting Rutgers on the right side of history. You are contributing to the conditions for life on planet Earth, which is a noble thing for any university to do. As somebody who teaches about climate change, I'm particularly, how can I put it? I'm particularly proud of this institution for putting its money behind its scholarship and for validating the science and social science that has been disproportionately generated by Rutgers for decades now. So I commend you for taking our money out of fossil fuels. I would like to add, though, in agreement with many of the students who've already spoken, that Rutgers needs to go the full mile. And that would mean going entirely solar for our energy generation, for our electricity generation. But also, and I'm particularly glad that students have spoken about this, also extending those benefits to the people who live at our edge in Camden, New Brunswick, and Newark. We have an opportunity here to actually provide resilient, affordable electricity to the vulnerable people who are often Black and brown, who live on our doorstep, who don't benefit a great deal from Rutgers now, but they could if we generate enough electricity to provide to them. We will actually change the entire makeup of our surroundings and extend the beloved community beyond our boundaries. We, the union, will be making recommendations to the President's task force along these lines and hope that we can work with the administration and with all the groups who've already spoken over the next year towards this kind of a vision. What it involves is the campus going solar, but also providing microgrids for communities which will operate during a hurricane and create resilience and emergency services for people in New Brunswick, Camden, and Newark. When the next Hurricane Sandy hits this state, which it will, I expect Rutgers to be providing power and to be saving lives in our 3 communities. So that, I think, is where we can go with this. We can be a leader in the climate transition and also be a leader in energy justice and environmental justice for these 3 cities in New Jersey. So thank you very much, and I hope we can work together on this kind of work in the post-fossil fuel era going forward.
David, thank you. Your remarks always are welcome here and always are appreciated, today particularly so. Thank you very much. Our last speaker today is Mr. Charles Cradaville.
Good morning, members of the board. Charles Cradaville, alumnus, live in New Brunswick. I'm the editor of New Brunswick Today, community newspaper here. I want to congratulate the new board members, but also I think it's worth taking the time to thank all the students and activists and community leaders who advocated for this move. It is a good move, and I'm glad to see Rutgers going in this direction. And credit where credit is due, it's because of those people, the grassroots, who were pushing for this for years to make it happen. So thank you sincerely for having the vision to make this a reality. And I will just close by saying, Mr. Chair, you still have not answered my questions from the last meeting, and I hope that someone at the university will be able to answer those questions. It was unacceptable the way that I was treated at your last meeting.
You're out of order. You're out of order, Mr. Cradaville.
And again, it's unacceptable how you're treating me now. And I would just say that if you're not up to the job, you should resign. If you can't answer questions about the things you're passing here, you need to leave this office. Thank you.
Is there any member of the board who wishes to speak or ask any questions of either Dr. Ballantyne or Mr. Gower? Hearing none, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Yeah.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? The resolution is passed. Thank you very much. Hearty congratulations. Mr. Gower, 10 years is a long time. Get us out of those private investments as soon as reasonably practicable, please.
You bet.
And with that, this meeting is adjourned. God bless everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
University of New Jersey. Before we start, I'd like to please remind everyone to keep your videos and phones on mute, and to kindly wait until the end of each presentation to ask your questions. Please raise your hand via Zoom or type your comments or questions in the chat box. I'd like to turn to Secretary Paspa to read the statement of compliance with the Open Public Meetings Act.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Pursuant to Public Law 1975, Chapter 231, the Open Public Meetings Act, public notice of this meeting was filed on July 9th, 2020, and amended on March 2nd, 2021, with the Office of the Secretary of the State of New Jersey and 3 newspapers, the Cherry Hill Courier Post, the New Brunswick Home News Tribune, and the Newark Star Ledger. Pursuant to Public Law 2020, Chapter 11, public notice of the meeting has been posted on the Rutgers website under Governing Boards. I would like to ask the members, you've all seen the agenda and the meeting materials posted on the Governing Board portal. Does anyone have a conflict of interest to disclose? And I ask that you please raise your hand so we can see it, because there are so many of you. Mr. Chair, I do not see any possible conflicts. We can continue. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next on the agenda is matters presented by the President, President Holloway. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon. Thank you. So I have good news to share, which is always a pleasure, a rare pleasure in my job. Good news to share about Rutgers students and faculty. Rutgers has been listed among the top producers of Fulbright U.S. student grants for the 12th year in a row. We are in a very special company in that regard. I think there are no more than 10 universities in the country can stake that claim. We also have 3 finalists for the Truman Scholarship, including 2 from Rutgers Camden, and a finalist for the Knight Hennessy Award at Stanford. We had a finalist for the Luce Scholarship, and although he did not get selected, it is still an accomplishment to be celebrated. And which is true for all of these fellowships. They are extremely difficult to get. I'm proud of all of these students for making it as far as they did. We heard recently that 2 physics professors, Blakesley Burkhart and Jedediah Pixley, were named 2021 Sloan Research Fellows, an award given to outstanding early career scientists and scholars. And I look forward to sharing more good news on the front of our faculty's accomplishments at this level when they happen. At the February, changing gears, talking about Rutgers and its own history, at the February Board of Governors meeting, we announced that as a further result of the excellent Scarlet and Black project, we will place 4 new historical markers in spaces at Rutgers named for individuals who were involved in and profited from slaveholding. At Hardenberg Hall, named for our first president, Jacob Hardenberg, who forced enslaved people to manage his household and whose family owned the abolitionist Sojourner Truth. A marker will be placed by Woodlawn Mansion, which was built for Colonel James Nielsen, an early trustee who profited from owning enslaved people. A marker will be placed on Livingston campus, named for the state's first governor, William Livingston, whose family made a fortune in slave trading. And a marker will be placed outside of Frelinghuysen Hall, the details of which are still being worked on as we correct some inaccuracies in the first statement of the historical marker. These markers are intended not to embarrass anybody. They are not intended to shame any family legacies. They are meant to speak directly to the complicated legacies of namesakes and the complicated ways that blood money from slavery is woven into institutions like Rutgers. This is an act of history and of bringing history into the present day. These markers will be sites of conversation, is my hope. These 4 markers, I should make clear, are the first of historical markers, and we'll be looking to the Scarlet and Black Committee for further guidance and expertise on other places around Rutgers University, not limited to New Brunswick, where historical markers are called for. Changing gears, COVID funding. As you know, Congress and the President have been working on a package of COVID legislation, well, it's going, I mean, I feel uncomfortable even saying much more details because things are so fluid at this particular moment. But the fact is that the bill contains $40 billion in aid to colleges and universities, including emergency grants for students. For Rutgers, we estimate this will mean $149 million from the Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund in the bill, based on the formula in the legislation. This is intended to provide financial relief to both our students and the university. The package also contains $350 billion for states, local governments, territories, and tribal governments, and about $130 billion for schools. With significant aid to states and local governments, this will take some pressure off the state budget here in New Jersey. It's good news for all of us. Climate Task Force. My monthly update message to the community in February focused on the President's Task Force on Carbon Neutrality and Climate Resilience. COVID-19 hasn't changed the urgent need to address climate change. We must be focusing on all topics all at the same time. A phase 2 report was issued earlier this year, and the task force aims to produce a climate action plan by the summer. As I told leaders of that process just last week, I believe, their work and their interim sharing of their plans with me have my full support. Commencement. Last month, I made the incredibly difficult and painful announcement that we will not be having an in-person commencement ceremony this spring. We did not arrive at this decision lightly, and I recognize that this news has been devastating to many students and many families. I've heard from a large number of them directly and indirectly, and I keep hearing from them. They all deserve better. They really do, and I mean that. However, a deadly pandemic is still with us, and although we are seeing good news on a daily basis about a coherence of our nation's vaccination numbers, and we're hearing good news about the dropping of mortality with this virus. The fact is We are now having to brace for another surge because of the variants that are spreading across this country with incredible rapidity. And we aren't out of the woods, as we've seen the headlines just, I think, today or yesterday. The next 2 months are really critical in terms of getting our hands on this virus while we wait for vaccination to be spread across the nation. Now, it is quite clear to me that we could have, of our 33 schools, ceremonies for a number of our schools in a way that's safe. Schools that are only graduating 100 people. We can do that. However, if we did that, we would still have to deny the opportunity to schools that graduate thousands of people. This is one of these moments where we must be fair to everybody, even if this fairness brings discomfort. We are all in this together, not just for a commencement ceremony, but for everything in terms of getting this pandemic under control. So I simply can't justify allowing a small unit to conduct an in-person ceremony when thousands and thousands would be denied that opportunity. This is not fun. This is especially for a first-year president who wants to, frankly, have an occasion that people can celebrate getting through a difficult time together. But this is necessary, I do believe. We've made the decision early, so campuses and schools can thoughtfully celebrate our remarkable and resilient graduates in the ways that they deserve, as long as that they are being done in a safe way. Those plans are being developed. Now, I want to hasten to add, we are going to have an in-person celebration for the students of 2020 and 2021. I know that in Newark and Camden, they are already working on the logistics of securing venues for that in the fall. We have eyeballed dates in New Brunswick for outdoor ceremonies in the fall as well. I don't want to say any more than that at this time for fear of raising up hopes on a particular date and then having them collapse. But I'm absolutely committed to making sure we honor these students and all of their hard work. And as soon as we have dates, we'll be sharing that information with the Rutgers community. Speaking about the fall, we are much more optimistic about fall planning. I told the community in January that we are planning for a fall in which all students will have the opportunity of face-to-face instruction in some format. And I say some format, for example, I think across the nation, you're going to see the large lecture phenomenon go virtual all across the country. Certainly that's our plan here, since even looking at a great, if we have a great vaccination outcome, we know that there will still be the opportunities for the spread of this virus in the fall semester. So packed lecture halls are not in our immediate future, but there will be opportunities for face-to-face instruction. Residence halls will increase their occupancy, although we will still have to keep space in reserve for quarantining. Departments will return to campus on staggered and rotating schedules that could include some telecommuting to be determined. And on-campus activities will resume while following CDC and state public health guidelines. And as you all know, that is a fluid dynamic, but we will do everything we can to get back up and running as soon as we can do so safely. We intend to be back 100%, but with the caveat, it may not all be 100% at all the same time. That last little caveat is not comforting to everybody, but I think from where we are now, it's quite a triumph to get to that place, and we're working very hard to get there. Our chancellors will be communicating with their campuses on what these plans look like as we get further in towards late semester and into the summer. Now, all of this assumes strong progress on vaccinations and the continuing decline in cases. And on the vaccination, it's not just strong progress on vaccinations, but uptake in terms of people being willing to take the vaccination. We will have much more to say about access to the university for those who are vaccinated versus those who, for whatever reasons, personal, philosophical, choose not to be vaccinated. We will have to cross that hurdle in due course, and I'll be sure to keep you posted. And that wraps up my matters. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions for President Holloway? Anna Haley?
Hi, President Holloway. I'm on faculty at the School of Social Work. We've talked before. I have two questions about two things that you brought up. One was with the effort to acknowledge Rutgers slave owner past. I'm wondering if consideration, in addition to the plaques, the signage that's going up, but there's consideration being given to doing something like I believe Princeton has done. Of course, for us, it would be much less expensive because we're cheaper tuition, of offering free tuition to the descendants of slaves associated with from those who were held by Rutgers slave owners. The second question is completely different. It's about, granted, this is going to come off a little self-serving, but I actually am concerned about my colleagues and my staff on campus as much as any faculty, is whether, given that we're looking forward to being in person in the fall as much as possible, what Rutgers is prepared to do to facilitate access to vaccines, given that in New Jersey and elsewhere, it's proving to be exceptionally difficult to do that.
Both are excellent questions. Quite different ones, but excellent questions.
Yeah, indeed, sorry.
The question about tuition remission of some type that follows along the lines of legacy, I quite honestly do not know that we have in the integrity of the records to make that determination. If it turns out that we do, I'd be happy to consider it. I think that there are important things to be thinking about in that way, as long as the people for whom we could prove that connection were qualified to attend the university. That's reasonable. But that's a good question to which I don't know the answer. I know the Scarlet and Black Committee worked very hard trying to just get to the point where we are at this point. So we'll have to think about it, just in terms of what the record can generate. The other question, vaccination. Yes, as Brian Strom will attest, we have the capacity to deliver quite a bit of vaccinations. We have places that have been approved or on the verge of being approved by the state. We don't have the vaccine. So there's no doubt we are very eager to be a distribution point for the vaccine for all of our students and for anybody in New Jersey, who wants to take advantage of that opportunity. We need the actual vaccine. So this is something where we're ready and want to be of service. We can't deliver something we don't have. That's the short version of it. So I share your concerns. I know Brian Strom and his team share that concern as well, and the frustration that's part of it.
Any other questions, Madam Secretary? Do we have any other questions that you can
I see a hand. Harriet Druskin has a hand up. Sorry, I don't mean to take over your job. I just mean
no, that's okay. I'm trying to shift through the screens and didn't do that fine. Go ahead, Harriet. You're on mute, Harriet.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Is there any plan to test students before they come on campus to see if they test positive? Other schools are doing this. I don't know if Rutgers has planned to do that or not.
Do you mean returning for the fall or currently?
Returning in the fall.
Yeah, well, actually, I mean, even currently, we also, if you're living in residence, I mean, currently, you have to be in negative, and you have to have tests on I think it's on a weekly basis. Tony's nodding his head. Yeah, I thought it was weekly. So we have that in place. And in the fall, what we're hoping for is that vaccination, will be robust amongst our student population. And what we are wrestling with right now, and this is not a declaration, it's just that the thing that we have to think through is what will allow people to have access to dormitory if they want to live on campus in the fall. And it may well be proof of vaccination. And then standard testing as is needed at that point in terms of what the guidelines are from the CDC. It becomes much more challenging in terms of for our off-campus students, in terms of access to classrooms, simply because universities have so many ways of entering that is a different kind of logistical question. But I know that Tony Calcato on the operations side, and Brian Strom and Vince Gracias on the medical side are working very closely together to figure out the right balance of public safety, being reasonable, and also the legal aspects of it. To what extent are we allowed to make declarations of who can have access to the education and in what form? So that's some of the layers of the nuance that are there. But we will certainly, when we come back, we need to come back safely.
Thank you.
Next question is Nimish Harry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. President Holloway, thank you very much for your comments and for everything that you're doing. I have a simple question. Everything that we all do is for our students and for the academics. Can you give us a little bit of idea of what the pulse of our students is and how are they managing through this? What's going through their minds and what are they thinking? I know that's a tough and a big question I'm asking, but at the end of the day, that is what we are all doing, is for the benefit of our students.
No, you're absolutely right. Thank you for that. By the nature of how Rutgers runs, I'm not the best person to answer that question in terms of being removed several layers. That I would look to our student affairs personnel. But what I do know, excuse me, more broadly, is that students are being incredibly resilient. They're incredibly frustrated, and it's hard. It's hard on the students. There's no doubt about it. I know there's been a serious uptick, and this is not unique to Rutgers, of students and professionals, staff and faculty wrestling with mental health issues out of just sheer exhaustion, psychological, emotional exhaustion from this. So that is something that we're wrestling with. But the students are really, I think, quite impressive. I know that we have some chancellors who are closer than I am, and so they may, if a chancellor is on the call and thinks that he or she has something more to offer in this way, I'd welcome that. But that's what I can tell you right now.
Thank you, sir.
This is Nancy. I might just add from a newer perspective that what the president has said is exactly right, both the mental health toll, but also things like digital divide issues, things like homelessness and housing insecurity, food insecurity and such. But the various CARES packages and our ability to use internal funds to support, for example, our undocumented students who don't get the federal or state funds, has really made a big difference. And I think, as the president said, the resilience is really quite extraordinary. Much more than we expected. The survey results on reactions to virtual classrooms has actually been pretty positive, or at least not as negative as one might have expected. So that's a slightly good thing in there. And there have been a lot of virtual student events that have carried on.
I will add very quickly, and this will not stand up to analytical rigor, but I was doing a filming for a Big Ideas segment in the Honors College on the New Brunswick campus. And there are students, a small percentage of students living in the building, and they were sitting in a lounge next to where we were recording. So I actually saw live students for the first time studying, and this is very exciting, just 4 students. I walked over and we're all wearing masks and processing that reality, of course, but they were just like students. They were just happy to be on the campus, to have a bit of their, to have a sense of flavor of what it's like to be at Rutgers. These are first-year students, very excited, doing their homework. I mean, and really excited about, I'd not been in that space before, and so they took great pride in virtually explaining what was so great about this space. So, there's these young people are just so amazing in so many ways that they can find joy and opportunity in the midst of challenges. The one thing I want to actually turn it over to Prabhas Mogi for a second, who is much closer to graduate students, to make, we can't forget them as well. So Prabhas, do you have something to add on this front?
Nimesh, you can imagine that if you have a graduate student working on a PhD, these students have lost a year of extremely valuable time that they would spend on field research, on travel, access to specimens, all kinds of things. And so the one thing we've been working on is just extending support to the students that are working on doctoral degrees, PhDs and professional doctoral degrees, to allow them an additional semester, maybe 2 semesters, maybe even 3, of support so that they can complete that degree. You can imagine the frustration of someone who spent 5 or 6 years on a degree just to feel like they've run out of steam. So we're mobilizing this program with support from the chancellors in Newark, New Brunswick, RBHS, and Camden, and all the provosts are working together on this. So I'm pretty proud of this this movement, but I am very concerned about what this will do for our graduate student pipeline as well.
Thank you. Dr. Holloway, that's absolutely fantastic update, and just goes to show how much the university continues to do for our students. Kudos.
Thank you. We're working very hard.
Dr. Strom, did you have a comment?
You're muted, Brian. Oh, it says you're not, but you are.
Yeah, can't hear you.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. My wife was not home. I thought I could do without the AirPods. didn't work. So Neema, as you know, our students are heterogeneous, and really are a good demonstration of both what Prabhas talked about, what Jonathan talked about, what Nancy talked about. The graduate students are going through exactly what Prabhas talked about. Our students who are non-clinical have done surprisingly well, with remote learning. And in fact, we've learned lessons that even when we go back to and don't have to live this way anymore, there are lessons we will apply that will help our pedagogy going forward. Our clinical students are on the wards, they're in the hospital in the normal way. They've gone through incredible stress in this time, but they have graduated on time. In fact, we graduated them early in the spring, and to be able to go out into the workforce and be able to help. And no one has been delayed in their clinical degree because of it. Going back to the question that was asked before about testing in dorms, we've been testing people once a week, as Dr. Holloway said, the people who are in dorms from the beginning. During this winter, we've been testing twice a week. As the cases surged, as second surge in New Jersey, third surge for the country, we increased that to twice a week for the kids in the dorms.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comment on Nina Goel?
Hi, President Holloway. My name's Nina Goel, and I'm the undergraduate student representative. So the question that I had was, what was the decision process in placing informational plaques over renaming the buildings altogether, like other notable universities have done?
Why plaques instead of renaming? Is that the question?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Thank you. That runs on 2 lines. One, my own personal opinion, and also on Scarlet and Black Committee. As a historian, I'm very uncomfortable with the idea of renaming in general. Now, that's not always the case, but just as my first impulse, I get very concerned about universities. I mean, speaking just about universities who will change a name and applaud themselves for being progressive by whatever that means in that particular moment, and not engage in a more thoroughgoing and challenging conversation about the original decision in the first place. I'd rather the university do the hard work of having the name be in place and the marker there to explain what was happening in that moment. Historians get very, as a type, get very nervous about passing contemporary judgment on past terms. Knowing that in the future, we will be looked at in this moment as bizarre for perhaps eating meat or driving cars or things like that. I mean, the future does not look well upon the present or the past. So I wanted it's there for the academic engagement, the opportunity for conversation, so we understand the long histories of how we arrived at this moment. With a university as old as Rutgers, institutions like ours that are our age there is going to be blood money in any of these institutions. And I think that is an important thing to recognize, not just changing name on a building.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question.
From Linda Rivers. Linda.
There we go. Yes, two things actually. First, I just wanted to say thank you for sending out a copy of your book. I'm excited to receive that. But secondly, in general, what is the admissions looking like for the students coming in the fall with regard to testing, optional testing, and is enrollment up or down? How is that looking?
Thank you. I literally was just given this data like an hour ago. So I haven't processed it, but the short version of the story, I have a 4-page document that I'm looking at right now. The basic story is that university-wide applications are up 5%, and it varies by particular campuses, of course, but collectively up by 5%. Our international or out-of-state, our out-of-state domestic applicants were up 17.5% university-wide. That's a tremendous jump. However, in light of so many things happening in the world and also domestic politics of the last few years, our international applicants have plummeted and down 23.4% university-wide. It's not a surprise. I mean, frankly, it's an incredible challenge. International students are very important to who we are as a university on many different levels. So that's just a reality of our particular moment. So that is the basic sum, is that we are doing well or considerably better in terms of applications, except for international students, extremely well with out-of-state students. Enrollment, it's too early to make a declaration about where we are in terms of the numbers can look really bad right now versus if you think of the entire cycle, but they're going to change radically in 2 weeks. So that would be premature to say where we are, but Courtney McAnuff in Enrollment Management New Brunswick is feeling very good about where we are. We certainly have the largest applicant pools. I want to say in history, I'm not entirely sure about that, but the very large pools, and part is a reflection of SAT or going test optional, and that we will be test optional this cycle and next cycle. And they're going to be doing, which is change the way we have to do our admissions review to a holistic system, which I think is better, to be honest. And we'll do an analysis of what the matriculating bodies look like over the next 2 years before we decide on what's going to be happening on that third year out and beyond.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, I think we'll move on to the next item on the agenda. By the way, thank you for your comments and taking time to answer the questions.
Thank you.
So before I move on to the action items, I wanted to provide everybody a brief update on Scarlet Promise grants and some great news. I am happy to announce that we have surpassed our $3 million goal for the Scarlet Promise grants endowment. In fact, we're at 4.7 million in what has been less than 2 years in this process. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank President Holloway. His announcement when he became president to fundraise for Scarlet Promise grants and his continuous focus on support drastically increased our ability to fundraise for the endowment. But while we've surpassed our goal, we cannot stop here. Our goal for the remainder of the year must be now to help the president reach his $10 million goal for Scarlet Promise grants. To date, about $7.5 million have been raised towards that goal. So there's still work to be done. Later, the Task Force for Philanthropy will provide you some additional information. But a couple of things. Please remember to mark your calendars for Rutgers Giving Day on March 24th. As you recall, our goal is to have 100% participation from the board trustees and the Emeriti towards Scarlet Promise grants. Today, that participation stands at 40%. So we have a way to go here and a lot of work to do. We will use Rutgers Giving Day to make a push towards the president's $10 million goal. And tomorrow you'll have the ambassador training to discuss how you can leverage your social network to make funds available. That is scheduled, like I said, tomorrow, March 10th from 9 to 10. Please make every effort to attend. But it will be recorded for those of you who have conflicts, so you can listen to it later. Look, going forward, we'll continue to work with the foundation to determine the path for fundraising for Scholarly Promise grants as they continue to map how this initiative fits into the larger campaign. But I just want to take a minute to recognize the incredible accomplishment and achievement that we've already made, not only raising funds ourselves, but also raising awareness of Scholarly Promise grants. So thank you, everybody. Okay, so moving on, I would like to call on Mr. Talak La, Chair of the Joint Committee on Investments, to present the report of the ad hoc committee on fossil fuel divestment and proposed resolution approving divestment from fossil fuels and amending University Policy 40.2.14 investment policy. Mr. La.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to also introduce, all of you know Dr. Brian Ballantyne. He's our SVP for strategy. He's on the call with us. Brian chaired the subcommittee on fossil fuel divestment. So before we jump into the specifics, I want to just give this board some context. Number one, divestiture is rare, and it's meant to be rare. We've only had in our long history twice, two times that we've divested. Once in the 1980s, we divested from the South African apartheid government and companies that had contracts with the apartheid government. And then again in 2006, we divested from the Sudan regime, the genocide regime in Sudan back in 2006. So this is meant to be a very rare occurrence. And I'll just mention that for fossil fuel divestments, the divestment request that came through our formal process included 4 other industries and areas that the requester, a student group called the Endowment Justice Collective, wanted us to divest from. This was the only one that made it through so far into the process, and the Board of Governors had voted on it just earlier this morning. So in terms of the history, in June of 2016, the Board of Governors and the Board of Trustees approved a revision to our investment policy. And the revision was in response to a series of discussions before the Joint Committee on Investments regarding investments directly or related to fossil fuels within the long-term investment pool. Before that time, there wasn't a process, and the JCOI would have to make those assessments on an ad hoc basis. The policy, the new policy, calls for the CFO and the chair of the Joint Committee on Investments to review any divestment requests and determine whether the request has sufficient merit to go further in the process. And the next step would be an appointment of an ad hoc committee to review the merits of that divestment request. In spring of 2020, the Secretary's office received, it was actually the first full submission of a divestment request through this new policy that was put in place in 2016. And Mike Gower and I reviewed it and recommended an ad hoc committee. President Holloway asked Brian Ballantyne to set up and lead an ad hoc committee, the ad hoc committee, to review fossil fuel divestments. And that work began, I would like to say, because of COVID and sort of all the sort of preoccupation on people's plates. It began around
November of 2020. And that committee completed its report and submitted it to the JCOI last Friday, March 5th. I'd like to ask Brian to summarize the work of this subcommittee. Brian, if you're on.
Sure.
If I turn it over to you for.
Yeah, thank you, Tilak. I can give this group a brief summary of the work and the thinking that led to the report that you've seen. So let me begin by thanking you all for considering the resolution and thanking the members of the subcommittee of the ad hoc committee who were engaged in this process. It was an incredibly thoughtful group, diligent, rigorous, exactly what you would hope for and expect, I think, from the Rutgers community. This was a group of 15 people, 6 faculty, 4 students, and 5 members of the administration. Including our chief investment officer, Jason McDonald, who served as an advisor to this group in an ex officio capacity. As Tilak mentioned, we worked from December through February to produce our recommendations. We began by analyzing the questions that are outlined in the advisory statement on divestment, discussing the principles of this work and recognizing the importance of this committee to serve as a guide for future committees who might consider similar questions. We were briefed on the status of fossil fuel investments in our endowment, and we were briefed on the board's fiduciary responsibilities as they pertain to any potential recommendations that would come out of the ad hoc committee. We then broke this committee up into 3 subgroups, each led by a faculty member. The first considered the question of consensus. The second looked at the university's actions in this area as they pertain to fossil fuels already. And finally, we had a group that considered the ethical and social injury questions connected to fossil fuel investments, both locally and globally. At our second meeting, these subcommittees reported back on their preliminary determinations, and the notes from that discussion are included in the memo of the appendix of the memo in that broader document. In our deliberations, we observed cross-cutting agreement in our community related to fossil fuel investments. We observed that multiple and diverse groups have expressed support for divestment from fossil fuels. We saw evidence from student leadership, Camden, Newark, and in New Brunswick, from faculty, from the community at large, and we saw a clear commitment from the university itself for carbon neutrality. We noted that divestment has frequently been a topic at the university-wide town halls that the President's Climate Task Force has led. We further noted that this was an issue where there's been agreement around its importance that is enduring and consistent, that Rutgers has seen itself as a leader in sustainability and carbon neutrality for decades, and that fossil fuel divestment is an extension of that priority. And we observed the well-documented evidence that divestment aligns with our stated values around public health and social justice. So we then formed a final subcommittee that drafted recommendations on a path forward. And they did this with attention to fiduciary responsibility and the expectations of the values of the community. In our recommendations, as you see in our memo, we erred on the side of brevity. We felt that the body of evidence from the community and the university itself was compelling. And that in terms of thinking about precedent, sets a high bar for future considerations on similar topics. We aspired to keep our recommendations very simple. And as you can see, they fall into 3 main categories: to cease all new fossil fuel investments, to divest from passive index funds within 1 year, and to exit all current privately held investments within 10 years. We also recommended informing our investment partners of our stance to ensure that their instruments align with our values, and regular review of the portfolio to ensure consistency in our position. And I'll note that and commend the JCOI for adding a further recommendation that there be an annual reporting of fossil fuels in the endowment. So with that, Tilak, that summarizes the work of the committee, how we arrived at our recommendations. And I'll conclude by saying thank you again for entertaining this important topic.
Thank you, Brian. And I'd just like to add, Brian, for you and the committee, you guys just did a wonderful job of putting your individual sort of interests and agendas and thoughts aside and when you mentioned fiduciary, that you sort of looked at these recommendations from the perspective of the fiduciary responsibilities of the board. And I really want to underscore that. I think that comes out in the recommendations, that these, the recommendation and the resolution that we're presenting to this board and the Board of Governors really sort of are consistent with our fiduciary responsibilities in managing the endowment assets. Thank you, Brian. With that, let me open it up to any questions or comments from the committee before we get to the resolution. Norman?
Thank you for a very carefully prepared presentation. Is it possible to estimate cost? That is it possible to estimate the impact on the performance of the portfolio?
Yeah, I mean, you hear investment advisors always saying that past performance is not a guarantee of future returns, and certainly the past performance over the past decade of fossil fuels and sort of the companies that explore and extract fossil fuels hasn't been great. We think that there's a market structural change, whereas these commodities were at one point an inflation hedge with sort of a need or a sort of place in the portfolio from that perspective. They no longer are. If you look at sort of the returns of just crude oil and compare those to that of the S&P, there's a high correlation and a low return. So that's one side of it. The other side is we have plenty of alternatives as far as inflation hedges and basic ballast to the endowment portfolio going forward.
So your qualitative analysis indicates that there should be no negative impact on the performance of the portfolio.
Correct. And Norman, I do want to add that if the way this recommendation is structured and the way that JCOI sort of reviewed it and is presenting it in the resolution, there will be no fire sales of our assets. The majority of our fossil fuel assets are in privately held investments. We're going to let those roll off. We're not planning to, and we're not going to sell those on the secondary market.
Thank you.
Bob?
Yeah, thank you very much for the thoughtful report. Similar question to Norman's. The divestment from passive index funds, which obviously carry the lowest carrying costs, will that have a measurable impact on the going forward performance?
No, that's a great question. So that's an area that in our divestment recommendation, I'd say we're ahead of where other university endowments that have divested have sort of gone forth. Others haven't sort of addressed sort of passive index funds. There's been a remarkable growth in ESG alternatives to passive funds, to the vanguards and so on. And that's continuing rapidly. I can tell you my company, which, I would not allow us to invest in, but just as an example, because for conflict of interest reasons. But my company has an initiative to put together a fossil-free version of the S&P 500 and the MSCI EFA and so on. And we're not alone. I think there's a big interest, particularly from Europe and increasingly from North American endowments for such index funds.
Thank you.
Jeannie? Oh, sorry, Jeannie, you're on mute.
I was involved with the South Africa one for a while, and that took a long time. I also remember the Sudan one, but I talked to the students about this a year ago, and this makes sense. And I follow this closely because climate change and all this ESP stuff is what I'm into. But I'm very proud of Rutgers for doing this at this time. Good report, a lot of excellent work. It has to be our fiduciary responsibilities, but also for the last couple of years, fossil fuels have declined because of climate change. And they are not good investments, just from an investment point of view. So I think this is a win-win for Rutgers. Our students clearly want it, but also I think a lot of our faculty, staff, and people in the United States, in this state, are very interested in this because of climate change, and economically it doesn't make any sense either. So it was a smart thing to do, and we will now be in the forefront of this with a few other universities around the country. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Jean. I will add that in sort of somewhere in the depth of the report, you'll find, sorry, that our endowment staff, through the various recommendations and updates I bring to this board, has been reducing our exposure to these assets over the years. And just by way of reference, when we divested from the apartheid regime, our exposure to the companies connected with that divestment was 18-19%. Here, we're down to just about 5% at the moment, primarily in our private assets, but you know, that's come down, I believe, from 8%. So, you know, in terms of the impact to the endowment, one, I'd like you to take comfort with the fact that it's we're not starting with a very large exposure. We were already in sort of trending down for the reasons Jean mentioned. And secondly, the majority of our exposure, and I think it's 2/3 of that 5%, is in our private investments. The recommendation gives us a ramp out of 10 years. We think we'll be able to get out of those privates much sooner, but we'll get out by just letting those roll off and not making any new investments.
Any other questions?
Good questions and good comments.
Mr. Chair, Marty Gillis has a question.
Hey, Marty. Marty?
Yes, I'm trying to unmute. Okay, so some of it you've covered in your presentation. I'll follow up with Jeannie. So basically we had approximately 60 million and we're down to about $11 million.
No, I think it's a little higher than that. We should be at around 70 or so million now. That 11, I'm not sure where that 11 million came from, but it may have been in part of the endowment, but in aggregate, we should be at around 70 to 90.
Because in the report, it says we had 60, because about 6% was exposed, which
right.
And they related that
yeah,
to
we're at
billion.
around 1.7 billion now as of Friday. Yeah.
Okay, so we have approximately 70 million, are you saying, that we're going to be out of in 10 years or
Yeah.
less?
Much sooner than that, but roughly, I can speak in percentages, and we're at, let's say, 5 to 6% of our endowment now. By the end of, within 10 years, we'll be at 0. We'll be out of the majority of that within half that time.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Marty. Any other questions? And let me just sort of summarize. I know we've kind of thrown some numbers around, and I'll speak in percentages, Marty. It's just easier for me than sort of dollar value, since our AUM grows year over year. But basically, of that 5 or 6%, 1% we're about to get out of in about 2 weeks through a redemption we made recently. 3.2% is in private investments that would roll off well before 10 years. 0.5% and Bob, this is to your question, is in passive index funds. So that's where we'd look for fossil fuel-free alternatives. And there's mention of commingled funds and sort of engagement with our hedge fund managers. That's less than 0.5%. That's about 0.4%. We also have some separately managed accounts that are managed exclusively for Rutgers. We have no fossil fuel assets in there, but we've included them in the resolution just for completeness, meaning there would be no new fossil fuel investments allowed in those separately managed accounts or anywhere in our portfolio decisions.
Anyone else?
Mr. Chair, with that, I'd be happy to read the resolution so we can move forward.
Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So whereas the Rutgers University investment policy includes a process the university should follow when members of the university community request that funds within the Rutgers University endowment be divested from, or that the investment office should avoid making new investments in certain industries, sectors, or companies due to a potential conflict between the university's position on an issue or agenda that is held or advanced by such industries, sectors, or companies. And whereas in the spring of 2020, the Joint Committee on Investments received a request from the Endowment Justice Collective, an association of several Rutgers student groups, individual students, professors, alumni, and community members, EJC they're referred to divest from fossil fuels among other sectors. And whereas pursuant to the process, the chair of the Joint Committee on Investments, chair, and the university's executive vice president, chief financial officer, CFO, determined that EJC's request regarding fossil fuels should proceed to the next step in the process, which is to form an ad hoc committee to evaluate the divestment request and make a recommendation to the Joint Committee on Investments. And whereas the chair and CFO formed an ad hoc committee of students, faculty members, and administrators from across Rutgers University that conducted its work of evaluating the divestment request in light of the three major elements set forth in the investment policies process regarding the divestment requests, and concluded its work by submitting the attached written report dated February 22nd, 2021 to the chair and the CFO. And whereas, as further described in the ad hoc committee's report, the ad hoc committee recommends that the university divest from fossil fuel investments by taking the following actions. Number one, cease all new investments in funds whose strategy is focused on fossil fuel investments. Number two, divest from passive index funds and exposure to fossil fuel investments within 1 year and reinvest in environmentally friendly versions of those indices. In addition, actively seek new investment opportunities in renewable energy and energy efficiency categories, provided they deliver competitive rates of return. Number three, exit all currently held private fossil fuel investments within 10 years or as soon as practicable. Number four, because some commingled funds may hold minimal exposure to fossil fuels, emphasize the university's stance on this topic to investment partners, urging them to review their own processes and decisions regarding the inclusion of such assets in client portfolios. And whereas on March 5th, 2021, the Joint Committee on Investments, JCOI, reviewed and discussed the ad hoc committee's report and determined that the ad hoc committee properly evaluated the divestment request, agrees that the recommendations can be enacted in accordance with the fiduciary responsibilities of the boards, and recommends that the Board of Governors and the Board of Trustees adopt the ad hoc committee's recommendations for divestment from fossil fuels. And whereas in addition to adopting the ad hoc committee's recommendations, the JCOI 1 states that for the sake of clarity, that these recommendations also include divestment from fossil fuel investments held in separately managed accounts owned by the university within the long-term investment pool. And 2, recommends that the investment office report progress of this divestment initiative annually. Now, therefore, be it resolved that upon the recommendation of the JCOI, the Board of Governors and the Board of Trustees of Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey, each agrees that Rutgers should divest from fossil fuel investments as more specifically described in the ad hoc committee's report attached hereto, and adopts the ad hoc committee's recommendations. And be it further resolved that the investment office should, 1, implement the recommendation within the parameters described in the report, while also being mindful of its fiduciary duty to apply the standard of care applicable to investment offices generally, and 2, report progress on this divestment initiative annually. And be it further resolved that the Board of Governors and Board of Trustees of Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey, hereby thank each and every member of the ad hoc committee for agreeing to be a part of this committee and for the work, effort, and time each member contributed to the process. And be it further resolved that the university investment policy, that's 40.2.14, be amended by adding a copy of this resolution as Appendix C thereof. And be it finally resolved that this resolution shall take effect upon approval by the Board of Governors and Board of Trustees. Mr. Chair, I bring this proposed resolution for vote.
May I have a second, please?
Second.
Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Abstentions? Motion carries.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I'd like to thank Mr. Baron Ballantyne and the ad hoc committee for their great work here and for such a great outcome. Thank you.
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
I apologize. May I ask that we do the vote again? We did not have enough people sound on when they voted. I apologize.
Okay, please unmute all of your phones. And let's do it.
I know I was unmuted, by the way.
Mr. Lau, will you please move the motion?
So moved.
Okay.
Second.
Yes, thank you. Any discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Any abstention? The motion carries. Thank you, Madam Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will also note that Mr. Harris does have his hand raised.
Okay, Mr. Harris, did you have a question before we move on?
No, I was voting by raising my hand
Okay, thank you, sir.
the first time.
Okay, next I will ask Mr. Michael Gower, Executive Vice President, Chief Financial Officer, and University Treasurer, to present the proposed resolution consenting to the Board of Governors resolution authorizing bank liquidity options for commercial paper program. Mr. Gower.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon, everyone. This resolution involves liquidity support for our commercial paper program. What does that mean? Commercial paper, or CP, is the university's short-term debt. Short-term meaning 7, 30, or up to 90 days in duration. We use this debt most often for capital construction until we issue long-term financing for projects. It's a very cost-effective method to provide that kind of financing. For reference, we only have $20 million outstanding at this time. Since it is renewed regularly, there's an outside chance that the market on any given day may not wish to remarket our commercial paper. We therefore purchase a form of insurance to pay back debt holders in case the market is upside down and we cannot temporarily resell our debt. For a number of years, we've had arrangements with banks to backstop up to $300 million through these very short-term cash needs, typically that last only one day. This upside down nature of the market has rarely occurred during my entire career, perhaps twice, but one of those was last spring when the COVID emergency was new. By the time we had to resell our commercial paper, the market stabilized thanks to intervention by the Federal Reserve Bank. Nonetheless, we looked at this and debated adding a more flexible option to our so-called insurance, in particular a bank line of credit to the backstop options. A line of credit can be used for a longer period of time if needed until a market settles down if we cannot issue new commercial paper. A line of credit could also be useful for an unexpected cash crunch. Typically twice a year, just before tuition bills get paid, we can drop to a point in cash where if it went any further down, we might otherwise have to liquidate investments to get through a few days or even a few weeks. A line of credit is very flexible for such short-term needs, and it is very likely that it will be less expensive by more than $300,000 a year to have than an additional traditional liquidity facility. The resolution we're asking you to consent to allows the university the option to have both a liquidity facility up to $200 million and a line of credit up to $100 million for these backstops. We are currently authorized by the two boards just for a liquidity facility up to $300 million. Thus, this does not change our borrowing authority nor our use of debt, simply the backstop methods we may use if needed in a market emergency. We do not expect to use these, but we are trying to address the unexpected. We will seek these options through a competitive procurement process. I'd be happy to take any questions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Any questions from Mr. Kawa? Madam Secretary, any questions? Okay, seeing none, Mike, thank you. May I have a motion to approve the resolution?
So moved.
May I have a second, please?
Second.
Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstention? The motion carries. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next, I will call your attention to December 17, 2020 meeting minutes that were posted on the portal and ask if there are any additions or corrections. Hearing none, the minutes are accepted. Next, I'll ask Mr. Jim Rhodes, Chair of the Nominating Committee, to present the report of the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The Nominating Committee of the Board of Trustees met 7 times between October 20, 2020 and February 18, 2021. The proposed recommended slate of nominees has been previously posted on the board portal for review. I would now like to present the Nominating Committee's recommendations on trustee, member of the Board of Governors, candidates for election of chair and vice chairs of the Board of Trustees, and trustee emeritus.
At this point, I would like to ask Mr. Lau to please assume the chair of the Board of Trustees.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Chair, would you close your ears? Is that what we say?
The lady has been banished.
Okay. Oh, perfect. We've got technology to help us now.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Rhodes, could I hand it back to you?
On behalf of the Nominating Committee, I recommend Jose A. Piazza as trustee member of the Board of Governors to succeed Sandy J. Stewart for the term July 1, 2021 to June 30, 2027. Mr. Chairman, I so move.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Nick.
All approve?
Aye.
Any disapprovals? Anyone disapprove? Any abstentions? Motion carries. Thank you, Mr. Rhodes. Can we have Jose back?
He is joining. But I think I lost him on my screen.
I don't see him either.
Mr. Chair, are you back?
I'm here.
Okay,
You're
great.
here.
Congratulations,
There's
Jose.
no video.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank
sir.
you, everyone.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I continue to be humbled, and I feel honored for the opportunities you give me and the trust you placed in me. and to continue allowing me to serve this university and you all. Thank you. Mr. Rhodes, let's first place Mr. Talak in the waiting room. Madam Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On behalf of the nominating committee, I recommend the following nomination for chair as indicated for the term July 1, 2021 to June 30, 2022. Chair Talak Lal. Mr. Chairman, I so move.
May I have a second?
Second.
Second.
Thank you. Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Any opposed?
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? The motion carries. Bring him back in.
He's on his way.
Oh, man.
Let me know when it's in.
Where's Talak?
Okay,
Mr.
I'm
Ah,
here.
yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Congratulations, Talak, on being
Congratulations.
elected chair for
Thank you,
2021,
everyone.
2022.
I'm beyond humbled and sort of want to just express my gratitude to the nominating committee and to this board for allowing me to lead it this coming year. Thank you.
Congratulations. Next, Madam Secretary, would you place Dr. Costa and Mr. Haveri in the waiting room?
All right, give me 1 second and I will tell you when it's done. Hold on. There are so many of you. Okay, got it.
Okay, Mr. Rose, please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On behalf of the nominating committee, I recommend the following nominations for vice chairs as indicated for the term July 1, 2021 to June 30, 2022. Vice Chair Alan M. Costa Jr., Vice Chair Nimish S. Havari. Mr. Chairman, I so move.
May I have a second?
Second.
Second.
Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
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 Any opposed?
Aye.
Is that in favor or opposed? In favor. Any abstention? The motion carries. Bring them back in.
They are coming into the meeting. Okay, Mr. Chair, I do see both of them back.
Dr. Costa, Mr. Haveri, congratulations on being chair for next year.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Congratulations, guys.
Congrats.
Okay, Mr. Rhodes, please continue.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Pursuant to the bylaws, section V1A 2B, the trustee emeritus shall be elected no earlier than at the first fall meeting after his or her term on the Board of Trustees ends, shall begin their term at the next trustee meeting following their election. On behalf of the nominating committee, I recommend the following individual as trustee emeritus. James F. Doherty. Mr. Chairman, I so move.
May I have a second, please?
Second.
Second.
Any discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? The motion carries.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This concludes the report of the nominating committee.
Thank you, Mr. Rhodes. Next, I'd like to call on Dr. Garuti to introduce the continuing education topic and our guest, Dr. Anna Branch.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good afternoon, everyone. I am delighted to welcome back to the board Dr. Anna Branch. You will remember that Anna addressed us back in September 2019, shortly after she arrived at Rutgers in August of that year, in the position at the time of Vice Chancellor for Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Engagement for the New Brunswick campus. And she had joined us from the University of Massachusetts, where she had been Associate Chancellor for Equity and Inclusion and Chief Diversity Officer. Now, she had been working so hard and doing such a good job that President Holloway, shortly after arriving himself last July, promoted her to the newly created position of Senior Vice President for Equity for the entire university community. And in that position, she is playing a leading role in realizing the president's goal of making Rutgers that beloved community that he so often speaks about. So Anna, welcome back to the board. We're happy to have you. And please tell us, how have you been keeping busy since you were here last?
I'm laughing, keeping busy. That is definitely the short version. The short version is just keeping busy. Really delighted to be with you all. Thank you, Ron, for that generous introduction. I'm going to take you through really briefly an overview slide deck. It was made available to you in advance to just give the broader board some context of where we are as a university and where we're going. And then we're going to leave some time for some discussion around your questions on where we're going, inputs, and the like. So with that, I'm going to share my screen. Make sure we're good to go on viewing, and I'll talk you through what we're aiming to do, which is to chart an inclusive path forward for Rutgers and the process we're going about that, which is shaping a university-wide diversity strategic plan. I want to start first by revisiting the goals of the university equity audit. And my hope is many of you have had a chance to review, or at least are aware of, the university equity audit that was released last September, that was commissioned by the president soon after his arrival to assess where we were as an institution on the question of equity. And these were the guiding questions, the goals. They were to ascertain our current practices and whether they match or deviate from our aspirations of inclusive excellence, to define the challenges at present for Rutgers, to identify our aspirations or an ideal state, to understand the perceptions of the system of the university and how they can limit positive change, and to create a shared understanding that would guide our path forward. The purpose of that exercise, this was the key takeaway, was not to say, look at how great we are, but instead look at how great we can be if. And the equity audit really centered on the central administration. That was the focus. And it contained 3 parts. The first part was the self-study. So each central administrative unit went about a process of a self-study to ask some of these questions for themselves. A second key component was a leadership perception survey, which asks leaders mostly at the dean level and above, so deans, vice chancellors, chancellors, senior and executive vice presidents, as well as their direct reports, what their perceptions were of the university. That's a pool of about 150 people. Almost 88% responded to the survey. And there were a couple of key takeaways from that survey that I want to highlight for you. One was that there was a historic lack of attention to diversity, equity, and inclusion in university strategic planning. 9% said diversity, equity, and inclusion goals were clearly specified to a great extent. 8% thought we were making strategic investments that advanced DEI to a great extent. And 7% said metrics were used to gauge progress on university DEI goals to a great extent. The correlate to that is that the vast majority of leaders recognized that diversity, equity, and inclusion were critically important now. 99% viewed inadequate attention to diversity, equity, and inclusion as risky for the university. 88% strongly agreed that diversity, equity, and inclusion are institutional priorities. And 86% of leaders reported that diversity, equity, and inclusion is very important to Rutgers' mission and future success. So among our leadership, there is clear agreement about the path forward. The question is, how do we get there? So there were a couple things that came out of that equity audit in the set of defining aspirations. One was to go through a process of diversity strategic planning. And the aim here was to develop a clear vision, guided by strong goals and core values to signal an investment in a paradigm shift, leading to long-term culture change. And the aim is to develop a plan to meaningfully engage and expand DEI community engagement and raise the public awareness of purposeful partnership and engagement as a university priority. But realizing to implement that plan, 2 other things need to happen. We need to build the capacity to lead and support institutional change, and we need to build and retain an inclusive workforce. A part of the response, kind of preempting the release of the equity audit, the president announced his vision for institutional equity. In a message that was shared with the university community in September, he announced that Rutgers can be a leader on the national stage by redefining how and where we find excellence. And that commitment to excellence is born and bred out of a commitment to diversity. And the role of my office and the work we aim to kind of promulgate for the university is to do that, to provide a clear signal of institutional values and investments and how we hold ourselves accountable as we build a better university. So the aim, the message that drives what we do is inclusive excellence. And what inclusive excellence means is an institution has adopted the means for the cohesive, coherent, and collaborative integration of diversity and inclusion into the institutional pursuit of excellence. And strategic planning is the process through which we'll go through the process of assigning and aligning our efforts in service of this goal. So the process is underway. We started in late January, and the ask of the university community, all of us working together, is to pursue these priorities. The 5 priorities at the bottom: recruit, retain, develop a diverse community, promote inclusive scholarship and teaching, define substantial and substantive community engagement, build the capacity for leaders to create inclusive climates, and develop an institutional infrastructure to drive change are orienting priorities. They are ways that the university, all of our 4 components, and the central administration are thinking together about how do we do this? What does it mean for us, for diversity to not just be something that we talk about, but that we do, that informs our organizational functions? And the statement at the top is just a reminder for this, that in order to build a more diverse and equitable and inclusive university, these 5 priorities encapsulate areas where we need to make progress, things that we need to do so that as others look at us, they're clear about the ways that we're living out or embodying our commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And each individual chancellor-led unit, Camden, Newark, New Brunswick, and RBHS, are pursuing and outlining now and creating their goals around how are these goals, these priorities, expressed on their campus. So a couple of things, if you want to check out where we are online, at the website, diversity.rutgers.edu, I encourage you to visit. We launched it last November. It's a great resource to learn about what's happening across the university community on diversity. This toolkit is available. And this toolkit really aims to walk each member of our university community, our 60+ organizational units that span in size from small units to very large ones. If you think about schools as a unit, to walk us through a process of how do we actually go about doing this. So this toolkit guides you through the process and provides really concrete tools on how to support the work. And they're public for you to take a closer look at for yourself. We just closed the University Strategic Planning Assessment Survey, and over 5,000 members of the Rutgers community weighed in and told us, right, what they want to see us do in providing their vision, their ideas around how the university can go forward. There is a frequently asked questions resource online. So if you want to know some subtext, and we'll have a chance in a moment for some questions for you to learn more about the process, what our aims are, for instance, where the voices of alumni come in, that sort of thing. Those are things that we're pushing on, but that frequently asked questions tool is a resource for you as well. So I want to talk to you really quickly about the planning process overview. What are we doing? What does this look like? And so the first 3 steps of that planning process are at a unit level. And so the first step is to map out a planning process, form a committee, organize and launch it. So there's a real sense of how does this inform us on the ground? So it's not just the leadership, it's not just the Senior Vice President's office, but that we're working in a coordinated way toward an end. The second step is gathering information. One of the great things about Rutgers, particularly for those who've been here a while, is there's lots of amazing work happening on the ground. So be able to step back and gather information about what's happening and understand where the gaps are between what's happening and where we want to go. And that's what step 3 is. Develop a vision, set goals, and be able to articulate where the unit wants to move towards in the future. And the need, the kind of why of strategic planning are these. There's a lot of pieces, but they relate back to what the priorities for the university are. We want at the unit level for folks to be clear on what's the strategy for doing this? How are we thinking about our students and our staff and our faculty? How are we thinking about the way that the curriculum reflects diversity and equity within academic disciplines? And how are we integrating community or civic engagement? It's thinking about the classroom and culturally inclusive teaching practices, and thinking about the different frames of reference that students bring into their classroom experience. It's thinking about how do we deepen our relationships to the surrounding communities through partnership development with existing organizations and others. And then the last, leaders are critical. So how do we hone the capacity to build and sustain an inclusive climate that actively mitigates inequity? So these are the questions and the aim, the reason behind strategic planning. The last piece of the equity audit that I referenced really quickly, because I knew I was coming back to it here, was the equity scorecard. In the equity audit, there was a self-study, there was a leadership perception survey, and the aim of this scorecard was on 4 dimensions to weigh where Rutgers was on access, retention, success, and leadership by our chancellor-led units. And we focused in on where we had equity gaps. So we were looking particularly at historically underrepresented groups. And we're asking units as they go through the strategic planning process to reference the scorecard. It is a 10,000-foot view of the organization, but it does give us a really clear sense of where we want to see movement and change. The last part, the last 3 steps, if you will, of the planning process are at the chancellor-led unit and the university level. So the different chancellors in the central administration will be thinking about how do all of the units that compose our parts, our component parts, work together to achieve our goals. Understanding that it's not enough for us to have some commitment over here, but the really important thing is how we work together. And that vision that's communicated at the university level, step 5, is what are the overarching strategies and supports that are needed that's going to drive the fulfillment of the goals all the way through. And the final step is that it's not enough to have a plan, but to do it, right? So to track how we actually do it and how we share our benchmarks, our timelines, and the institutional support and investments going forward. So this is kind of a big picture of what all of our pieces are, if you will, a big picture schematic. We started with the equity audit on one side and excellence on the other. And the president's commitment from the beginning has been the institution is committed to the pursuit of excellence and seeing diversity as feeding that effort. And so the other processes, the chancellor-led unit planning, the strategic alignment that's happening within central administration, thinking about planning too, is all feeding into that strategic planning process. And it's going to inform the kind of effort that we put in on those priorities to achieve excellence. And in the working of all those things together, that's how we're going to build and make concrete our aims for a beloved community. And to be able to share out the kind of metrics and the mechanisms that we're using to do so. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions you have. Oh, you're muted, Matt. Ron, did you want me to take the questions directly?
Yes, if you would if the board members would direct their questions directly to you.
Okay, will do. I'm going to just go in order of my screen. Can I start with you, Anna?
Hi, so we work on the Student Essential Needs Committee together. I know my colleague Antoinette Farmer, professor of social work, has been very involved in this process. I want to ask a admittedly difficult question, which is that one, I this effort, the fact that it exists and that you're leading it, makes me very proud to be at Rutgers. Like, you know, another example of it. But what does not make me so proud is that we have these 130 some odd unsettled pay equity cases that were sat on by Rutgers administration at least 6 months prior to the onset of the pandemic. So it really cannot be explained, the delay, as all about the pandemic. And then we have a lawsuit against Rutgers by 5 full professor women who have lost probably well more than $1 million, they allege, in salary by being paid less than their male peers. It's hard for me to energetically get behind this and feel confident about it when Rutgers is being sued by its own women faculty, literally on the basis of equity. And I feel like for there to be integrity of this process, there needs to be not just kind of beloved community wording, but like a very meaningful settlement of that lawsuit and immediate completion in a impressive restorative way of those pay equity claims. Like I don't know how to simultaneously hold both of those things. And I imagine you probably have some frustration with that too, much of which you probably can't share with us today. But I mean, as a faculty, like I have principled issues with it, but it's from a trustee rep standpoint, there's some serious optic problems. Like Ruth Bader Ginsburg sued Rutgers Newark for this same issue when she was on our faculty decades ago. Like we need to move beyond this and be leaders in this as we are in what the initiative you're leading. So what do we do here? Like this is a problem.
Thank you for putting it on the table. One of the things, and there's a lot I can't say, but the piece I can say, and this is broadly to kind of how you think about what institutional commitment to diversity means. It doesn't actually mean the absence of complexity. It doesn't mean that there won't be kind of issues and moments where we want to pursue and be real and substantive in our commitments. And there will be things and moments and communities that say, but look at this thing that says, and it shows you're not, right? So it's having and being willing to sit in that complex reality and push forward, right? And so there is hard work going, and the president's spoken to this often, right, of a desire for resolution. So the work is ongoing, it is hard, it's difficult, but one does not make the other not true, right? And so the work, we have to do both.
Okay, so I appreciate that. I do want all the trustees to understand this is a very awkward time with this set of issues, given this initiative. Like we have an optics problem here. And I think the trustees would do very well to be well informed about the progression of these two issues, the pay equity cases and the lawsuits by full faculty. There's, assistant, associate, full. These are full, internationally known female professors who have sued the university for pay inequity. So it's an issue. It really has to be resolved well.
Thank you. I know there's a couple of more comments. I want to allow us to have a
yes. Reshan Taduk.
Perfect.
Hello, everyone. I hope everyone's doing well. Ms. Anna Branch, it's always a pleasure to have you present. I enjoyed your first presentation, enjoyed this one as well. Not to piggyback off and put more pressure on you. And I guess Ms. Haley mentioned a lot of the pressure that the university is facing in terms of equity. You mentioned 5 main goals in your presentations, which I caught on. To reiterate, first one is a diverse community in terms of the talent that we bring in. Second is scholarship and teaching. Third being community engagement. Fourth being inclusive climates for the leaders on our campuses. And the fifth one finally being infrastructural policies and I guess designs that drive all this, right? That combined with the previous discussion we just had, what is the greatest challenge that we're facing as a university as a whole? What is your greatest challenge? And although all of these things are great things to focus on, there has to be a few key things that I think would drive the rest of the funnel as like a domino effect, right? So my question is, what is that in your point of view?
That's such a great question. And I'm going to give you a slightly unorthodox answer. Because the greatest challenge isn't one of the issues, but it's how we approach the work of diversity. That there's oftentimes, in not just Rutgers, but it's a kind of organizational problem. I use the metaphor diversity as sprinkles, right? It's something that we sprinkle on top, right? And kind of it's like you look, you see, we did it, as opposed to what does it mean for it to inform the function of what we do, right? In a substantive, baked in way. That's the biggest challenge. And that's the through line of all the priorities. It's to ask us organizationally to do the work of baking it in, right? So it's not like, oh, look, we did diversity over there, but it's like, no. Like, how does it inform our functions? How does it inform the kind of everyday work that drives the organization forward? That's the biggest challenge. And the process and the way that we're going about planning is really to ask people to take that approach, that it's not just to, and it's not, there are times where we want to do the kind of celebratory thing on the side, one initiative, but that deeper organizational work is really what's going to drive change in the long term.
As a follow-up to that, in your presentation, you mentioned that almost 5,000 people responded to the survey. So I'm not sure what the exact number is, but I believe we have around 60,000 members in our Rutgers community. It may be higher. It probably is higher. What should we be doing as board members of the governors and trustees? And more, I guess, at a deeper level, how can we really get this message to the student level? Because they're the greatest asset. They're bigger in numbers and they're bigger in impact, right? So how can we overall just be more involved to bridge that gap between 5,000 to the remaining 60 or 55,000?
Absolutely. I think just that students were at 50,000 plus, right? So the Rutgers community is quite substantial. And the numbers that responded to the survey are definitely not taken to be the end all be all, right? But they're a touch point, right? To say what, for those who wanted a vehicle to speak into the process, what do they want to see? But the broader process that's kind of rolling out within the campuses and within schools and within student affairs units are really creating a lot more platforms within local organizations, within departments, right? With student government associations to speak to and kind of be much more involved in. So the aim between now and May is that there'll be a lot more engagement of kind of the broader university community. And the work really is that when we get to the place where we have a plan for this is what it will look like, but there's no member of our community that says, I had no idea that was coming. I never had a chance to speak. That all the way through, folks will have kind of heard about and had a chance to say, if Rutgers did one thing, this is the thing, right? I want to see us at least talking about this thing and start to build that up and across. So there's lots of ways. And if you stay tuned and stay tracked on our website, it's kind of a aggregator as we make sure that the opportunities and potentials for folks to be involved are listed there.
Okay, thank you. I look forward to it.
Welcome.
Ms. Wilma Harris.
Dr. Branch, thank you as always. In terms of optics, and I'm sure your group is looking at this, Black men on the Rutgers, New Brunswick campus has been an issue, I would say, for at least the past 5 or 6 years. There are various and sundry reasons why this has occurred, but optically, it's something that I'm assuming, and one should never do that you and your staff will be looking at in terms of root causes and how we can address it, not just short term, but long term.
Yes, is the short answer. And it's not just a Rutgers problem. This is a broader higher education problem, but definitely we are looking at local solutions that kind of meet the needs of our community. When I moved into my senior vice president hat, I still oversee the Division of Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Engagement, and the educational equity unit there that kind of focuses on supports, kind of targeting. That's actively some of the work that they're thinking through around what's the supports that are needed, understanding what the root causes are and what the university can do.
The data indicate the acceptance rate is on a par, but it's from that accept to accept coming that we seem to lose a lot of the Black men. And then between sophomore year and junior year, or whatever you call it these days, 60 to 90 credits or whatever. But it is an optical issue that adversely impacts our ability to attract and retain more students.
Yeah, and as we continue our work and are able to talk in a more concrete way about what the institutional strategies are to deal with some of the areas that I know are challenges, and you've raised some, Anna raised some, that we'll be able to speak to. Here are some of the things that we're thinking about to be able to respond in concrete ways. Last year, for instance, we launched the Paul Robeson Success Institute. And that's kind of a high impact strategy. It serves as a 2 to 3 day early campus experience that is not exclusively Black, not exclusively male, but there's a high proportion of them that are in that experience. And thinking about what are the carry-throughs, what are the follow-ups, and there are a lot of initiatives that exist, not necessarily at Rutgers, but can be brought here that are much more targeted. So there are options, there are things that we can do. And the aim is that we'll be able to talk more about those as the days go along.
Thank you.
May I add one thing here, please?
Yes.
Thank you for all of these questions are just pretty fabulous. And I think you can see why I think Anna Branch, I tapped her for this job. On this very specific issue, It's not just about words coming from university synod addresses like the one I gave in September, and building out a team who understands this, but also I'm leaning into it as well. I mean, I'm told it's for the first time, I'm doing, the president is recording messages for targeted populations who've been admitted to Rutgers. I think this is specifically New Brunswick because the demographics are such where that's where the biggest gap is. So I'll be reaching out through enrollment management to populations where there's been the matriculation gap specifically, and holding a live town hall for those students and their parents, which is, I think it is important that the administration serves as a touch point on these issues, signaling the importance with which we hold these issues.
Thank you. Dr. Garudi?
Yes, Anna, when you and I spoke the other day, I indicated to you, and I'm glad President Holloway is still on, I absolutely love the concept of the beloved community. That is what presidents and CEOs do. They set big goals, and then it's up to everybody in the community to do their own part to address them. Some of the individual goals that we talked about and you showed again today are very easily measurable. We can count numbers, we can look at salaries and do those kinds of things. But my question to you, and maybe also to President Holloway, how will we know if we've achieved a beloved community?
I love the question and I love the frame. It's one of the things that made me excited to take on this role under this president because of the frame. And on the website, if you haven't had a chance to check out the beautiful poster that we developed for Beloved Community, I really would encourage you to. It's gorgeous. It's the image that was on the last version of my slide. But more than just the metrics and the kind of concrete means for us to pursue the goals, the broader narrative behind Beloved Community is an aspirational idea, to be a community that kind of respects and wrestles with the complexity of its parts, right? Where we're kind of holding who we are, right? That notion I've said often that it's not just about compositional diversity and it's not just about coexisting, but what does it mean to kind of build and support an inclusive community, to kind of have cross-cultural understanding, to be able to talk even when we will disagree. Those bigger aspirational ideas, I think, are some of the things for us to push on alongside the kind of metrics-driven things that we know we need to do.
I can, Ron, since you used my name as well, I'll chime in. Excellent question, and I appreciate your enthusiasm for the ideal here. And it's an ideal, right? And so this is going to be, just as the ideal, not to be too grandiose, the founding documents of this country represents an ideal. Have we ever achieved them? We haven't. But we must do everything we can to fight to achieve them. And for me, that's what the beloved community is. And I'm not trying to dodge the point, like people like to measure things. And that we do need to do that work, absolutely. But for me, the beloved community will be an ongoing project, partly because the university is always renewing itself, literally every year. There's a quarter of the population is replaced at the undergraduate level, but because we can always do better, frankly. One of the things that I found very frustrating, and I was talking to a couple of members of my team about this just I think this week, is what I found from different quarters, and everybody is guilty of it, deep wells of distrust within this community. And until we can find a way to actually start to trust one another, and again, everybody is guilty of this, that work of achieving the beloved community is a distance away. And I think what Anna said is exactly right. We need to be mature within ourselves, among ourselves, that we can actually wrestle with disagreements and still recognize we're part of the same organization and still wanting to make it better in a forward-moving direction. So I can't give you the actual answer because looking at the model of this country, it is an imperfect union, but we must always try to keep working towards it.
And that, if I can add, that's where each of us must play a role.
Yes.
The big things, the recruitment of various groups to faculty and students and all, we can do that, and we can measure that. But we all have a responsibility on an interpersonal level with every interaction we have to try to respect each other, to hear each other's point of view. And that's, I think you can feel that when it happens, and you can also see it when it doesn't. You mentioned the distrust, but that's where every one of us has to play our part, right?
Amen.
Are there any other questions for Dr. Branch? Because if not, I want to thank you again, Anna, and you really have a big job to do and an important job. And that's where I think every one of us can help you on an individual, interpersonal level. Mr. Chair, I just have one announcement, if I may, before I turn it back to you.
Please.
I'd like to remind everyone that tomorrow evening, we will have our third virtual campus site visit. We had excellent virtual tours of the New Brunswick campus in January and the Newark campus in February. And we have another one planned for tomorrow evening of the Rutgers Camden campus. And Interim Chancellor Margaret Marsh will be joining us. And once again, we will be hosted by student ambassadors who put a lot of time and thought into what they say at these meetings. And I would encourage all of us as trustees to lend our support by joining the session tomorrow. Thank you.
Hey, Ron, this is Ron Wilson. Hey, I think those tours have been tremendous. And I think Brian talked about it before, you know, unintended consequences. But as we go forward after the COVID period, will something like this be available for all prospective students or whatever? Because I think it's a great tool for recruiting people. And take the best of those 3 tours. I've seen 2, and we'll see the 3rd tomorrow. But I think it's a tremendous way for people to get a feel for the institution.
It is, Ron, and there are already on each of the campuses, if you go on the websites, there are virtual tours that have arisen out of necessity because of the pandemic. And I think you're right, like everything post-pandemic, there's going to be a lot of learning. And I would not be surprised if there will be a great deal of those learnings implemented as we go forward. They'll never replace the interpersonal tours, though.
No.
But, thank you for those comments. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Dr. Garrodi, and Dr. Branch. Thank you for joining us today and for your comments. We look forward to your work here to move Rutgers forward in these important issues that you've discussed today and that you heard from the board members today. So thank you. Next, we have our committee reports. So first up is the Committee on Diversity and Inclusion and Outreach. So I'll ask Dr. Sam Salanders to present the report.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The most recent meeting of the Diversity Inclusion Outreach Committee was held last week, March 4. And the committee shared feedback from their outreach efforts this year with the board members and emphasized the effectiveness of the slide that was developed for the outreach purposes. We then discussed the effectiveness of the outreach efforts and explained that there were some mixed feelings among the trustees. Some said they would reach out to their organizations or associations, and while others were a little bit confused around the nominating process. And committee then discussed ways that we could improve the outreach initiative by including the process a little earlier so that the trustees had time to think about individuals that would be prospective nominees. This is something I'll get to in a minute. So we then reviewed the timeline for the trustee nominating committee as it pertains to the work of this committee and suggested some alterations to the timeline for our committee. Those being beginning the outreach no later than the end of September, including announcements for the nominating for nominating under old or new business on each of the BOT meeting agendas, actually creating tools and guidelines that will be prepared for next year's committee that they can use, especially for the newest members who really don't quite understand perhaps, or may not understand perhaps yet, the actual role of the committee. And then finally, providing advance notice to all trustees that the members of the DIO, as I call it, committee, will be reaching out to them, particularly in a particular period of time during the year, so that they would be expecting our calls. We then reviewed finally the talking point slide deck that we prepared in our committee setting, and discussed suggestions that we could make to that slide deck. And we've started doing that. I think we've already made some suggestions, some changes, and there may be some others that may come. Finally, the committee discussed suggestions on amplifying our information on affiliates that the trustees, affiliations that trustees have with outside groups and other groups within Rutgers. And we thought that perhaps preparing a brief survey and asking the board members to update their affiliations with the affinity groups, and whether they would be willing to foster a connection between those groups and our committee, so that we can fulfill the purpose of the DIO committee going forward. And with that, if there are no questions, I will turn it back to you.
Any questions? Okay, so thank you, Dr. Sampson-Landers.
Thank you.
Next is the report for the Joint Committee on Investment. Mr. Law, could you present the report?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Not used to having so many speaking spots.
I want to get used to it.
Yeah, the Joint Committee on Investments met on March 5th, and the minutes of the meetings proceedings are in your materials, but I'll summarize them. We've made some investment recommendations to Tiger Global Private Investment. Again, sort of proactively looking out for fossil fuel investments, or a lack of. 15 million to Illuminate Capital and 10 million to Asia Alternatives. We've discussed, reviewed, and recommended some asset allocation shifts, which are also in your materials. Importantly, through December, and we've had our typical sort of reporting period lags by a couple of months to sort of get the official returns in, and those are quarterly. So as of quarter end, December 31, 2020, our 1, 3, 5, and 10-year performance numbers were 9.1%, 7.4%, 8.9%, and 7.8% respectively. We're very happy with that. And through February, this is the latest information we received prior to our meeting. Through February, our performance for the fiscal year was 18.8%. We're also very happy with that. That left our endowment or the long-term investment pool at approximately 1.6 billion in AUM, and the total endowment assets at 1.7 billion. Mr. Chair, that concludes my report, and I'd be happy to take any questions the committee might have, the board might have.
Any questions for Mr. Lau? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, next is the report from the task force on legislative engagement. So Mr. Duhane.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Just to go over what we've been doing on the task force on legislative engagement. Just as a reminder, our goal is not to make policy for the university with the legislature, but simply to improve our relationships with individual legislators, especially at the leadership level, so that should there ever be a need where there needs to be advocacy to the legislature, that we are in a position to do so where we already have built relationships, as opposed to just coming in heavily with an ask. So we have done a number of things this year, which I appreciate the support of Pete McDonough's office. First, my fellow board members, Chairman Piazza, Mr. Grudy, Mr. Berzicelli, and I have met with 3 of the 4 legislative leaders thus far. The 4th one is pending. We've met with Senate President Steve Sweeney. A big part of that meeting was expressing our gratitude for his support to reinstate some of the funding for higher education that had been cut in the original budget proposal last year, and he was happy to hear that from us. We've done the same with Speaker Coughlin, Minority Leader John Bramnick, and we have a meeting pending with Senator Tom Kane, who's the Senate Minority Leader. He's agreed to meet. We have not done that one yet, but we will. We've also tried to improve relationships with legislators across the board through the trustees, and we thank you for your help in doing that. We've fairly simple touches. We've tried to have 3 touches with each legislator from trustees within their districts. Legislators like to hear from their constituents, especially when their constituents are of some level of note, being a trustee, for example. We've said
I may have had soundboards, it looks like, in this room, so he's ready to go.
Mike,
I see that in
you're
the
on
back.
mute, and Anthony, yeah, okay.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. We've sent them Rutgers mask, legislative directories, and some good things to know about Rutgers sheets. So we've sent those out. Those have gone out. We've had great participation from our fellow trustees. So thank you very much for that. One thing that we did last year, which we cannot do this year because of COVID, is an in-person visit. We had many legislators come to a basketball game last year. We couldn't do that this year. Our hope is that next year we can invite legislators to one kind of a sporting event like that, and another one that is probably some sort of tour of an academic building on campus as well. So again, the whole goal to create and strengthen these individual relationships so that should they be needed at some point, we can call upon them. Lastly, I'm also a professor, or an adjunct, I should say. I teach one class in the political science department, and some of these same leaders have been very supportive in that, and I hope that helps strengthen those relationships. Speaker Coughlin and Minority Leader Bramley came to speak to my class, as did Governor Murphy, and so we try to use that as well as a way to continue to foster those relationships. So as I said, we just have one more meeting to go with Senator Kane, and then we will have concluded what we wanted to do this year. With that, I'll turn it back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Any questions for Mr. Dehane? I have to say that I have attended these meetings, and they are very well received, and the legislators have been very appreciative. So it is important that we continue to do this to strengthen the relationship between the board, university, and the legislature. So thank you, Mr. Dehane. Next is the report from the Task Force on Philanthropy, Ms. Papamarcu.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will keep my comments brief because Jose covered a lot of these things, so they may be a little bit of a replay. The Task Force on Philanthropy met twice since our last board meeting in December and has been hard at work preparing and sharing information about the upcoming Rutgers Giving Day, March 24th. As Jose mentioned, it is exciting that we have met and exceeded our $3 million goal, and it is not without the encouragement and engagement of President Holloway as he began his tenure last July. I want to give my personal thanks for his helping to bring the spotlight to Scarlet Promise grants, something that for many of us began several years ago out of our findings on a task force for financial aid. Jose mentioned that we are going to be working towards the $10 million goal, so keep that in mind as I head into the next part of these notes. The Task Force on Philanthropy conducted outreach with trustee members that I hope was informative and collaborative. In the absence of in-person meetings and events, we thought it would be a great opportunity to engage and inform on Scarlet Promise grants and our board goal for 100% participation. Ambassador training, as Jose mentioned, will be conducted tomorrow at 9 a.m. by our partners at the Rutgers Foundation. It is an opportunity for each of us to take advantage of our social media networks to increase awareness and giving to Scarlet Promise grants on Rutgers Giving Day. A replay of the session and its contents will be made available after the webinar. A step-by-step guide on how to share Rutgers Giving Day details on your social media will be included in the training. Expect follow-up from a task force member in the next 2 weeks prior to Rutgers Giving Day to help with any questions or comments you might have. And we recognize and appreciate that many people have long-term giving plans with the foundation, and we hope that you will consider an allocation of Scarlet Promise grants on Rutgers Giving Day. And as I mentioned, Rutgers Giving Day is March 24th. With that, I will take any questions and yield the floor back to you, Mr. Chair.
Any questions, Mr. Dr. Crosta? Alan.
Mary. Hi. Mary, are we as trustees going to get some kind of a link that would, by email, that would take us directly to the Scarlet Promise Grants endowment, such that we can get there easily, and also send that to our contacts so they can get on easily to make donations?
Yes, I know that last week a lot of people who are also athletic donors may have received a link to the specific Rutgers Giving Day link for athletics. We will have something dedicated for trustees and for their social media networks that will actually link to our goals of giving. So if if this link that you post to your network, someone clicks through your social media link, it will be recognized in our totals.
And Mary, that is part of the training tomorrow, correct?
That will be part of the training, and expect as we do follow up as we get closer to Rutgers Giving Day with our outreach program, we're going to meet one more time as a team before Rutgers Giving Day, and we'll take any questions that have come from Rutgers Giving Day. We're all sitting in tomorrow, so we'll all listen in if there's questions. We'll also continue to do outreach to help people to understand how the communication process will work.
Okay. Norman Edelman?
Yeah, that link I think will be useful. Will that be available in time for Giving Day?
Yes, we should have that tomorrow during the Rutgers Ambassador training. The presentation deck will be walked through, and post training, we're going to share it out to everyone. And it'll have a one-page, Norm, hopefully, that'll be easy enough for you just to follow step by step on how to cut and paste into your social media network. So you should have it latest by Thursday, but more likely tomorrow.
By email. I
By
can't
email,
attend
yes.
tomorrow's training
Yes,
session.
yes, by email. We're going to share it out by email.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you, Ms. Papamarco.
Thank you.
Next is the update from the Merita Outreach Group. Ms. DiMartino?
Thank you. Good afternoon, all. I'll be brief and just say that our team met about a week ago, and it followed sort of an Emeriti happy hour on February 16th that had a great turnout and a great discussion about ways to engage Emeriti. Obviously, we have primary focus this year of supporting giving, and in particular giving to Scarlet Promise grants. And so we're ready to be on tomorrow's ambassador training call. But in addition, this group is also looking to outreach to other board members in addition to Emeriti. So that will be sort of the next piece of the work that we're doing. Had a lot of great ideas about how we can serve as a resource to the BOT in addition to its giving efforts. So our next step is to really reach out to other Emeriti and seek their support and helping us engage with former BOT members and really broadening those members and scope for engagement at the university. So that's it.
Any questions from the board? Okay, thank you, Ms. DiMartino. Next is the report of the Executive Vice President and Chief Financial Officer, Mr. Gower. Can you present the audit report, please?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. The Committee on Audit has met twice since the last meeting of this board. First meeting on January 21st, the minutes are in your packet. At this meeting, I reviewed the annual report of professional service fees for the past fiscal year. Dr. Timothy Fournier, Senior Vice President for Risk Management, discussed the committee's role in understanding, reviewing, and setting the scope of compliance and ethics activities at the university. Dr. Fournier also gave a brief update on increased education underway to raise awareness on the risk of undue foreign influence on federally funded research. Mr. Eugene Simon, Associate Vice President, Deputy Chief, Enterprise Risk Management, Ethics and Compliance Officer, provided an overview of how University Ethics and Compliance is working to assess the compliance program and strive for continuous improvement. Ms. Ruth Philo, Chief Audit Executive, informed the committee on updates to the 2021 annual audit plan to maximize audit effectiveness with available resources. She also discussed recent staffing changes, completed audit services, audits in progress, and presented implementation status for past audits. Ms. Shelley Massey, KPMG Lead Partner, and Ms. Lauren Swigert, KPMG Senior Manager, gave the committee a brief update on the status of various efforts of KPMG for fiscal 2020, including the agreed upon procedures report on the university's intercollegiate athletics program for the year ended June 30th, 2020, which was issued on January 13th, 2021. The second meeting was on Thursday, March the 4th. The minutes are not yet available, but I can give you an overview of that meeting. Again, Ms. Massey and Ms. Swigert brief the committee on the status of the federal single audit and the state of New Jersey single audit for the year ended June 30th, 2020. She also reported that the independent auditors report, the financial statements of the university for June 30th, 2020 had been issued, and they were sent to the committee earlier, or sent to the board, excuse me, earlier. The single audit reports for the year ended June 30th, 2020, as well as auditor reports on supplementary information and agreed upon procedures are expected to be issued by March 31st. Mr. Kim Yozgat, Chief Healthcare Risk Officer, provided an overview of the RBHS medical malpractice program, including a brief history, current levels of coverage, renewal challenges, recent claim activity, and loss prevention activities. Ms. Michelle Noren, Senior Vice President and Chief Information Officer, provided an update on cybersecurity and its impacts on Rutgers. She provided industry predictions and trends, specific impacts to higher education and Rutgers in particular, and what the Office of Information Technology is doing to address those risks. Mr. Eugene Simon provided an update on the risk assessment process and discussed the office's risk assessment methodology, partnership with management to remediate risks, and implementation of a monitoring process. And Ms. Philo gave another update to the annual audit plan and discussed the status of recommendations for past audits. The committee endorsed a resolution reappointing KPMG as the university's external auditors for the year ended June 30th, 2021, and that will be going to the Board of Governors for its approval on April the 14th. Mr. Chair, that concludes my report.
Thank you, Mr. Gower. Any question for Mr. Gower? Okay, thank you. Any old business? Under new business, I would like to once again remind everyone about the Rutgers Giving Day Ambassador Training tomorrow from 9 to 10. If you haven't signed up, please sign up. And then as Ron also mentioned, the virtual tour of Camden in the afternoon. Mr. Azar, you have a question.
Just on that point, Jose, if Kim or Pat could resend out the invitations for the Camden tour and also the board training. I think we're all lazy. If we can have it in our inbox, it would make it easier. We might get more participation.
You read our minds. We will be doing that today.
Mr. Duke?
This is off topic. I received an invitation for the Big Idea Symposium. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to attend, but if there's a recording of that symposium, please share it with the board members. I know I personally want to take a look at it.
Okay, we'll look into that.
There is a recording. There's a recording.
Okay, we'll Ms. Passback, and you would also make that available. Okay, thank you. With that, may I have a motion to adjourn so we can give people some time back?
So moved.
So moved.
May I have a second?
Second.